In August, 20-year-old Michael Madden went on a solo camping trip to a place he knew well. He never came back. His campsite was found intact. His belongings were untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no clear trail, and no explanation. Days later, his dog returned alone. Michael did not. Today, we're going to walk through what is known, what was overlooked, and the unsettling questions that still surround Michael Madden's disappearance. As you watch, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Sandbar Flat lies deep within Stanislaus National Forest, a vast forest in Tuolumne County, California, where paved roads have disappeared, replaced by winding dirt and rocky trails. To reach it, one must drive along sharp turns, following the mountain slopes, with the Stanislaus River flowing below, its water crashing against the rocks, creating a low, resonant sound that echoes throughout the valley. The feeling upon approaching the campsite is one of stark separation from the outside world, as if each kilometer further in creates a fading echo of everyday life. For Michael Madden, Sandbar Flat is linked to early memories. Past family trips have given him an understanding of each technically sound plot of land, each trail leading down to the river, each patch of forest where a campfire could be built. This is the style a young nature lover would choose when needing a few days off from their daily routine. Bringing a fishing rod, minimal personal belongings, and spending quiet mornings by the water's edge. Michael Larry Madden was born on January 22, Itsenzobe Tshishilo, and by the summer of 1996, he was 20 years old, an age marked by transition rather than uncertainty. He was no longer a teenager testing boundaries, yet not fully settled into adult life. Instead, he occupied that narrow space where habits, values, and long-term direction begin to solidify. Michael grew up in and around Twain Harte, a small mountain community in Tuolumne County where forests press close against homes and the outdoors is woven into daily existence rather than treated as a destination. People who knew Michael consistently described him as grounded and deliberate. He stood about 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed close to 200 pounds, broad-framed and physically strong. He carried himself with an unhurried confidence, the kind that comes from familiarity rather than bravado. This physical presence mattered. Michael was not fragile, nor easily intimidated. Any scenario that involved him being overpowered would require either sudden surprise, a credible threat, or a calculated manipulation of trust. He was the type of person who paid attention to his surroundings and responded thoughtfully rather than impulsively. Michael had brown hair, hazel eyes, and a noticeable surgical scar along his left collarbone. To his family, it was just another detail that made him recognizable, something remembered instinctively rather than consciously. Later, that scar would become one of the few concrete identifiers investigators held onto when discussing the possibility of remains. At the time, though, it was simply part of him. Unchanging, unremarkable, familiar, academically. Michael was a student, and several accounts place him at Humboldt State University, an institution well known for its focus on forestry, wildlife biology, and environmental sciences. His academic interests aligned naturally with his personal ones. Michael was deeply drawn to nature, not as a hobbyist or thrill seeker, but as someone who saw the wilderness as both a responsibility and a calling. Friends recalled conversations where Michael spoke about working in conservation, land management, or environmental protection. He viewed forests as systems to be understood, respected, and preserved, not conquered or exploited. This perspective shaped how he moved through the world. Michael was not reckless. He did not chase danger for excitement. When he went into the wilderness, it was with purpose and routine. He planned, prepared, and followed patterns he had learned over years of experience. Sandbar Flat the site of his final known trip, was not an unfamiliar or intimidating place to him. He had camped and fished there multiple times, often with his father, learning the layout of the land through repetition. Over time, those trips created a mental map, where the ground leveled enough for a tent, where the river slowed, where sound carried, and where it disappeared into the canyon walls. This familiarity is crucial to understanding Michael as a person. He was not someone likely to wander aimlessly or lose his sense of direction. He knew how long it took to hike certain distances, how daylight shifted across the terrain, how quickly conditions could change. When Michael chose Sandbar Flat for a solo trip, it reflected confidence built on experience rather than naivety. That same sense of responsibility extended to his family. Michael had a habit of leaving notes when he traveled, especially when heading into areas with limited contact. On the morning of August 10, 1996, he left home around 5 o'clock, before sunrise, after writing a note to his mother explaining where he was going and outlining his general plan. This was not an unusual gesture for him. It was a quiet reassurance, a way of saying, "I've thought this through," to his mother. Those notes mattered. They represented continuity, reliability, and trust. Michael drove his Chevy Cavalier towards Sandbar Flat with the expectation that friends would join him later. This detail often gets overlooked, yet it speaks volumes about his mindset. He was not disappearing into isolation. He was initiating a trip that would begin alone and then become social, following a timeline that made sense to him. He had done this before. There was nothing impulsive about it. One small but telling detail about Michael involved his name. Among family and close friends, he was Mike or Michael. He strongly disliked the nickname Mikey and corrected people who tried to use it. This preference was consistent enough that it became part of how others understood him. It reflected his personality, quietly firm about boundaries, attentive to how he was addressed, comfortable asserting small but meaningful lines. This detail would later surface during witness statements and take on a significance that no one could have anticipated at the time. Socially, Michael kept a relatively small circle. He was friendly but reserved, more comfortable in one-on-one conversations or small groups than in loud gatherings. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words carried weight because they were considered. Friends remembered him pausing before answering questions, scanning his surroundings as if habitually aware of space and movement. One acquaintance later recalled Michael once saying, half joking, "Out here, you notice things people miss." At the time, it sounded like a casual observation. In hindsight, it feels heavier. The morning of Saturday, August 1996, began in a way that felt ordinary to everyone who witnessed it. In Twain Harty, California, the air was still cool before sunrise. The kind of quiet mountain morning where sound travels farther than expected. At approximately 5:00 a.m., Michael Larry Madden stepped out of his family's home and into the driveway, carrying the kind of calm focus that comes with familiarity rather than excitement. This was not his first time heading into the Stanislaus National Forest, and it showed in the way he moved. Unhurried, methodical, comfortable in routine. Michael loaded his gear into his Chevy Cavalier, a compact car that had already made this drive more than once. Fishing equipment went in first, followed by camping supplies that had been used, cleaned, and repacked many times before. There was no improvisation here. Every item had a place. A tent, cooking gear, food packed to last several days, extra water, and clothing suitable for warm days and cold nights in the canyon. Before leaving, Michael wrote a short note to his mother, explaining where he was going and when he expected to return. It was not dramatic or emotional, just practical, the kind of note someone leaves when they expect to come back and want to avoid unnecessary worry. He closed the door quietly behind him and pulled out onto the road as the sky began to lighten. The drive from Twain Harte to Sandbar Flat is not short. Nor is it forgiving. The road winds deeper into the forest, gradually shedding signs of residential life. Houses give way to trees, pavement narrows, and the sense of isolation grows mile by mile. For Michael, this drive was familiar. He had taken it with his father years earlier, had camped and fished along the Stanislaus River more times than friends could easily count. This place did not represent danger to him. It represented continuity. By the time Michael reached the Sandbar Flat campground later that morning, the forest had fully woken up. Sunlight filtered unevenly through tall trees, casting long, broken shadows across the dirt clearing that served as the campsite. The sound of the river nearby was constant, low, and steady. A background presence rather than a focal point. Sandbar Flat was not a tourist-heavy destination. It lacked the visual spectacle of major national parks and offered little infrastructure. That was part of its appeal. It was quiet, predictable, and, to someone like Michael, reliable. He parked the Cavalier near the spot he had used before and began setting up camp. The tent went up first, positioned with practical awareness of ground slope and shade. Next came the fire ring. Michael gathered wood from nearby, stacking it neatly. Then arranged the fire pit in a way that suggested experience rather than improvisation. A fire built to last was different from a fire built in haste. This one was constructed with patience. His movements remained deliberate. He unpacked fishing gear, leaning rods carefully against a tree, and checked supplies, as if mentally confirming a checklist he had used many times before. At some point, he lit the fire. Not aggressively, but steadily, and tended it until it settled into a controlled burn. The campsite now looked lived in, claimed, familiar. At this point in time, Sandbar Flat belonged to Michael Madden. The tent, the fire, the gear, the vehicle. All of it confirmed his presence and control. Nothing suggested interruption. Nothing suggested haste. Nothing suggested conflict. Friends were expected to arrive in 2 days. Michael knew this. He had planned around it. The camp was not temporary or transitional. It was set up to be occupied, maintained, and shared. This was not the behavior of someone preparing to leave quickly or change plans unexpectedly. It was the behavior of someone settling in throughout the day. Michael would have followed a rhythm that came naturally to him, fishing along the river, adjusting camp as the sun moved, checking supplies, tending the fire as needed. No witnesses later reported seeing him that day. But the absence of sightings in a place like Sandbar Flat was normal. The campground was remote, sparsely visited, and offered long stretches of uninterrupted solitude. That solitude was part of why Michael chose it. By nightfall on August 10, the campsite was fully established. The fire would have been visible from a distance, a small, steady glow against the darkness of the forest. The tent stood where it had been placed earlier, and the Chevy Cavalier remained parked nearby. Everything about the scene suggested continuity rather than disruption. In the early morning hours of Monday, August 2, Michael's friends arrived at Sandbar Flat Campground sometime around 2:00 a.m. The drive itself had been uneventful, long and quiet, following narrow forest roads that twisted deeper into the Stanislaus National Forest. There had been no discussion of emergencies, no sense of urgency. This was meant to be a casual stop, an unplanned visit before a fishing trip. As their vehicle rolled into the campground, the headlights swept across the clearing. Almost immediately, several details registered at once. First, Michael's Chevy Cavalier was there. It was parked close to the campsite, in a familiar position, angled the way Michael usually left it. This mattered. From an investigative standpoint, the presence of the vehicle confirmed that Michael had arrived as planned and had not left the area using his car. There was no sign of damage. No indication the vehicle had been moved or tampered with. Second, The campsite was set up. The tent stood upright. Camping gear was arranged around the site. Fishing equipment was visible. Everything appeared orderly. Nothing suggested abandonment, haste, or disruption. The scene looked exactly like a campsite belonging to someone who expected to return to it. Then they saw the third detail. The fire was still burning. At approximately 2:00 a.m., a fire at Sandbar Flat could only mean one thing. Someone had tended it recently. The type of wood commonly used in that area burns down quickly without maintenance. A fire left unattended for hours would collapse into embers. This one had visible flame. One of the friends reportedly said something like, "Good, he's awake." At that moment, Michael's absence felt temporary. They assumed he had stepped away, maybe to the river, maybe into the trees. They expected him to reappear any second. They stepped out of the car and called his name. Mike. The sound carried farther than expected. The canyon amplified voices, bouncing them off rock and water. There was no reply. They waited. A few seconds passed. Then they called again. Louder. Still nothing. This was the first moment of unease. Michael was known for responding. He was known for keeping track of his surroundings, especially at night. He also had a dog that usually reacted to approaching voices. The campsite felt occupied, yet strangely empty. As they moved closer to the fire, the atmosphere changed sharply. A man stood near the fire. He was positioned close enough to the flames that his face was partially illuminated, partially obscured. His stance was deliberate, feet planted, body angled slightly toward the group. In his hands, clearly visible in the firelight, was a handgun. One of the friends later described the moment as everything tightening at once. The man spoke first. "Who are you looking for?" The question caught them off guard. This was Michael's campsite. One of them answered instinctively, "We're looking for Mike. This is his camp." The man paused, then said, "You looking for Mikey?" That word stood out immediately. Among Michael's close circle, that nickname was rarely used. The group exchanged brief looks, registering the oddness of the choice. It suggested unfamiliarity, or something more unsettling. Over the next several minutes, the man handled the gun repeatedly. Witnesses later described him audibly manipulating the weapon, a deliberate, repeated action. The sound of metal moving cut through the quiet of the forest. The gesture was impossible to ignore. No one approached the fire. No one sat down. No one raised their voice. They asked where Michael was. The man gestured vaguely toward the trees, offering no clear direction. No explanation of when Michael had left or why. His answers were fragmented, sometimes trailing off, sometimes shifting topics. As minutes turned into hours, the situation became a standoff. The man remained by the fire the entire time. He behaved as if the campsite belonged to him. He tended the fire. He stayed in control of the space. He did not invite conversation. Yet he did not leave. One of the friends noticed something else. The boots the man was wearing. They looked strikingly similar to a pair Michael owned, boots Michael wore often on camping trips. The detail lodged itself in memory. As the sky began to lighten, more of the campsite came into view. Michael's tent remained closed. His gear was untouched. His car remained parked exactly where it had been hours earlier. There was still no sign of Michael anywhere along the riverbank or nearby trails. By daylight, confusion had turned into fear. At that point, the group contacted authorities. When law enforcement arrived later that morning, the situation was reframed officially. Michael Madden was treated as a missing person. His belongings were present. His vehicle was present. A stranger had occupied his campsite overnight, armed, and had interacted directly with witnesses. Deputies began by separating the friends and taking statements. Each account returned to the same fixed points. Arrival around 2:00 a.m. The burning fire. The armed man occupying the campsite. Michael's absence. the prolonged standoff that lasted until daylight. Names were written down. Times were sketched on a pad. The description of the man at the fire, later identified as Joseph Tyne, became central immediately. His presence introduced a human variable that shifted the investigation's direction from environmental mishap toward potential criminal involvement. That same day, officers located and questioned Tyne. He carried a .45 caliber handgun, which deputies examined. His explanation followed a simple narrative. He claimed Michael had left the campsite voluntarily, heading toward the river or into the forest, and that he had stayed behind using the camp resources. He described casual interactions with Michael, borrowing items, sharing space. He framed his presence as opportunistic rather than aggressive. The weapon, he suggested, served personal protection in a remote area. Investigators documented the firearm and checked it for obvious signs of recent discharge. No spent casings appeared in the weapon. That detail would later carry outsized influence in shaping the early trajectory of the case. With limited physical evidence and an intact campsite, the initial posture of the investigation leaned toward uncertainty rather than accusation. While deputies worked at Sandbar Flat, another process unfolded miles away. Michael's family received the call later that day. The message arrived abruptly, without preparation. Michael had failed to meet his friends. Authorities requested information about his plans, habits, and timeline. His mother reacted with immediate alarm. The details clashed with everything she knew about her son. He planned his trips carefully. He left notes. He respected routines. The idea that he would simply vanish from a familiar campsite made little sense to her. Family members provided officers with critical context. Michael's familiarity with Sandbar Flat, his experience in the outdoors, his physical strength, and his habit of remaining close to camp at night, they emphasized that he traveled with purpose and preparation. This background quietly undermined the early assumption of a routine misadventure. By August, tree-nast search activity intensified. Deputies returned to the campground to expand their assessment. They photographed the scene. They documented the placement of the tent, the fire pit, the vehicle, and the surrounding area. The river drew attention. Its current, depth, and terrain offered an explanation that investigators had seen before. Rivers solved mysteries by erasing evidence. This theory required fewer assumptions, fewer confrontations, fewer legal risks. Search teams began moving along the riverbank, scanning for signs of a fall, a slip, or disturbed ground. The terrain offered plenty of places where a body might remain hidden by water, rocks, or vegetation. From a procedural standpoint, this approach followed precedent. Many missing campers ended this way, yet several inconsistencies persisted. Michael's gear remained behind. His vehicle remained untouched. His tent showed no sign of abandonment. There was no trail of urgency leading toward the river. Experienced investigators knew that people who slipped into water often left clues, dropped items, disturbed soil, signs of panic. Here, the campsite retained a sense of continuity. Witness statements about the armed man remained part of the record, though their significance competed with more familiar explanations. The fact that the man had stayed overnight at the campsite introduced discomfort, though it did not immediately dictate criminal classification. Without direct evidence tying him to harm, the investigation hesitated. Inside the family, tension grew. Michael's mother pressed for answers, replaying details repeatedly. Why would someone else occupy her son's campsite? Why would a fire burn through the night without Michael present? Why would an armed stranger remain there for hours after being confronted by witnesses? These questions surfaced early and stayed unanswered. Investigators scheduled follow-up interviews. They requested additional details about Michael's habits, his relationships, his mental state. Each answer reinforced a consistent image. Michael planned his trip, expected company, and had reasons to remain where he was. Nothing suggested a voluntary disappearance. By the end of August 13, the case sat in an uneasy space. Search efforts continued. Statements had been collected. A person of interest had been identified and released. The official classification still hovered near uncertainty, though the presence of a human actor at the campsite had already complicated the narrative. By Wednesday, August 14, 1996, the search had already crossed an invisible line. What began as urgency had shifted into endurance. Search teams returned to the command point with tired faces and empty hands. Boots caked with river silt and pine needles. Maps were spread across hoods of vehicles, marked with highlighter and pencil, each color representing a path already walked, a bank already scanned, a slope already climbed. The pattern was clear to everyone involved. The forest had yielded nothing human. The operation expanded anyway. Additional volunteers arrived, some from nearby towns. Others connected to the family through friends of friends. They listened to briefings in low voices, absorbing the same instructions again and again. Stay in pairs. Watch your footing. Call in anything unusual. A torn fabric. A disturbed patch of soil. A sound that did not belong. The Stanislaus River continued to run beside them, steady and indifferent, its surface catching light in flashes that made it hard to look at for long. Michael's mother remained near the edge of the activity. She spoke when spoken to, answered questions, nodded at updates. Each hour stretched longer than the one before it. At times, she stared down the river canyon as if expecting the landscape itself to respond. Someone offered reassurance in passing. These searches take time. She acknowledged the words, though they seemed to drift past rather than land. By Thursday, August 13, the search perimeter widened further. Helicopters made slow passes above the canopy, their noise briefly overwhelming the natural sounds before fading into distance. From the air, the terrain looked endless. From the ground, it felt intimate and confining at once. Searchers began to sense the weight that comes when every logical place has already been checked. When strategy meetings ended, there was less discussion, more silence. Late that afternoon, a call came through the radio. A dog had been sighted near the campground access road. At first, the report carried little certainty. Wildlife appeared frequently in the area. Dogs wandered. But then, details sharpened. The size, the coloring, the way the animal moved, slowly, deliberately, as if conserving energy. Within minutes, the information reached the family. Matilda had returned. When she emerged into view, the effect was immediate. Conversations stopped. People turned. The dog stood thin and unsteady, ribs visible beneath her fur, her movements careful. She paused, scanned the area, and then took a few steps forward as if guided by memory rather than strength. A searcher knelt instinctively, speaking softly. "Hey girl, you're safe now." Matilda drank when water was offered, deeply and without hesitation. Her condition told its own story. Days without regular food, prolonged dehydration, exposure, yet there were no obvious wounds. No blood, no limping severe enough to explain separation. The absence of injury raised questions that nobody voiced aloud right away. A dog bonded to its owner rarely leaves by choice. Her return alone reframed the search in a single moment. Michael's mother reached her slowly, hands shaking despite effort to remain composed. When Matilda leaned into her touch, the dam broke. Witnesses later described the scene as quiet rather than dramatic. Tears without sound. Grief without spectacle. Someone nearby whispered. She came back. The sentence carried both hope and dread, balanced uneasily between relief and realization. Investigators immediately understood the importance of this development. Matilda represented connection, timeline, possibility. Dogs often follow routines, scents, habits. Her return suggested movement away from the campsite and back again. Handlers attempted to read her behavior, watching for directional interest. Signs of recognition. She wandered briefly, then settled, exhausted. Time had dulled whatever trail she once carried. Dogs bonded to their owners display predictable protective behavior. They circle, bark, position themselves between threat and handler. They resist separation. Matilda's disappearance during the critical window, followed by her solitary return days later, disrupted that pattern. Her survival did not weaken suspicion. It redirected it. A defensive animal remaining alive suggests avoidance rather than confrontation, fear rather than attack. Investigators quietly explored several plausible scenarios. One possibility involved sudden auditory trauma. A gunshot fired away from the immediate fire ring could have startled Matilda into flight, sending her into the forest without injury. This hypothesis carried forensic weight. It aligned with the absence of spent shell casings at the campsite, suggesting that if a firearm had been discharged, it may not have occurred within the central area later examined by law enforcement. Another scenario considered physical restraint. Matilda may have been tied, confined, or locked inside the vehicle during a confrontation. Her eventual return. Exhausted, dehydrated, but unharmed. Left open the possibility of escape rather than release. Dogs trapped without water often survive longer than humans expect, though their condition upon recovery reflects the cost. A third interpretation involved deliberate displacement. An aggressor experienced with animals may have chased her off intentionally, understanding that removing the dog removed resistance, noise, and warning. In this framework, Matilda's absence became a tactical choice rather than an accident. What unified all interpretations was intent. None suggested randomness. Her dehydrated state reinforced that conclusion. During the days, Michael remained missing. Matilda had not been fed or cared for. This detail eliminated the possibility that she had stayed voluntarily with another person. She had survived independently, away from camp, without support. When strength allowed, she returned to the one location she recognized as safe. For Michael's family, Matilda became more than a reminder. She was the last living witness to whatever occurred. For investigators, she represented a timeline marker, a silent boundary between before and after. And for the case itself, her return underscored a central truth. Something had happened at that campsite that required preparation, control, and awareness. Questions circulated quietly. Had she been chased off? Had a loud sound driven her away? Had she waited somewhere before finding the strength to return? Each possibility implied human involvement, accident, or fear. None offered clarity. One investigator was overheard saying, "If she could tell us what she saw." The sentence faded unfinished. By Friday, August 16. Search leaders faced an unavoidable decision. Resources were finite. Coverage had been extensive. Conditions were becoming repetitive rather than productive. Plans shifted towards scaling back active operations while maintaining monitoring and follow-up. The tone changed. The forest had given something back, though it was not the answer anyone needed. Matilda's return became the emotional center of the case. For the family, she embodied loyalty and loss in equal measure. For investigators, she marked a turning point. For the searchers, she was proof that something had ended somewhere beyond their reach. One question lingered in the air, unspoken yet shared. If the forest could return the dog, why had it kept the man? By the time Matilda returned, attention had already begun to narrow toward a single figure described by every witness who passed through Sandbar Flat in those first critical hours. He was the man who occupied the campsite when Michael's friends arrived. The man who sat by the fire as if it belonged to him. The man who answered questions before they were fully asked. His name, provided during the initial contact with law enforcement, was Joseph Tyne. Investigators would later document that Tyne appeared at Sandbar Flat during the same window in which Michael vanished. He presented himself as another camper. Someone passing through. Someone who had crossed paths with Michael casually. According to early reports, his demeanor alternated between talkative and watchful, relaxed and tense, a pattern that drew attention even before formal questioning began. When Michael's friends encountered him in the early hours of August 12, Tyne stood near the active fire. Flames illuminated his face intermittently, casting sharp shadows that made his expressions difficult to read. Gear lay scattered around the campsite: coolers, supplies, personal items, arranged with the familiarity of use rather than discovery. One of the friends reportedly asked, "Where's Mike?" Tyne responded without hesitation, offering an answer that felt prepared rather than spontaneous. "He went off fishing earlier," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the dark beyond the trees. Then came the detail that lingered. Tyne asked if they were looking for Mikey. The word landed with subtle force among Michael's family and close friends. That nickname carried weight. It was rarely used, often rejected. Hearing it spoken by a stranger introduced an immediate sense of distance rather than familiarity. Investigators later flagged this moment as a linguistic inconsistency, small, yet revealing. It suggested access to Michael's identification, possessions, or paperwork, rather than a shared personal history. As the interaction continued, witnesses described Tyne handling a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. He held it openly, cycling it through his hands in a manner that commanded attention. The action itself required no practical purpose. The gesture communicated readiness, authority, and control. One friend later recalled thinking, "He wants us to see it." Another remembered the repetitive sound, the metallic slide, again and again, cutting through the night air. Over several hours, the group remained at the edge of the campsite, trapped between concern for their missing friend and the unspoken threat radiating from the armed stranger. Conversations circled, but never resolved. Tyne spoke about small things: camping, the river, the night. Yet his posture rarely relaxed. He remained positioned near the fire, near the gear, near what had once been Michael's place. When daylight approached, the tension shifted. With visibility came options. The group withdrew and contacted authorities. By mid-morning, deputies from the Tuolumne County Sheriff's Department arrived at Sandbar Flat. Tyne remained present. He provided identification. He answered questions. He explained his presence as incidental. According to his account, he and Michael had shared brief interactions, borrowed items, exchanged words. Nothing more. He claimed Michael had left camp voluntarily, heading toward the river. The story placed Michael alive and mobile after their last alleged interaction. Investigators documented Tyne's firearm and examined it at the scene. The pistol showed no obvious signs of discharge. No spent shell casings were recovered nearby. In the context of a remote forest floor layered with pine needles, dirt, and debris, this absence carried limited evidentiary value. Still, it became part of the early record. More attention settled on what Tyne wore. Multiple witnesses independently mentioned his boots. The style, size, and condition resembled a pair known to belong to Michael. One friend mentioned it quietly to a deputy. Another repeated it later during a follow-up statement. The implication hung in the air without resolution. In a wilderness environment, footwear holds practical and symbolic weight. Boots shape movement. They adapt to terrain. They mark ownership. When asked about the boots, Tyne stated they were his. With no immediate physical evidence to contradict him, the explanation entered the report as given. As the day progressed, deputies secured the area and initiated search procedures. Tyne was questioned further, then allowed to leave. He departed Sandbar Flat carrying his belongings, his firearm returned. His presence documented, but unresolved. No arrest followed. At that stage, the investigation remained classified as a missing person case rather than a homicide. In the weeks and months that followed, Joseph Tyne's name surfaced repeatedly in internal discussions. Detectives revisited witness statements. Timelines were cross-checked. Eventually, approximately 9 months after Michael's disappearance, Tyne agreed to undergo a polygraph examination. The results failed to produce clarity. Depending on the interpretation, the test suggested truthfulness or yielded ambiguity. Within investigative culture of the mid-1990 seconds, such outcomes often carried disproportionate influence. With limited forensic evidence and a remote location yielding few recoverable traces, the polygraph results slowed momentum rather than accelerating it. Yet, questions persisted. Why remain at another man's campsite for hours after his absence? Why assume use of his supplies? Why maintain the fire? Why introduce a firearm into a social interaction that involved concern rather than confrontation? From an investigative standpoint, Tyne occupied an unusual position. He stood neither fully integrated nor fully excluded from the narrative. He was present at the center of events, yet remained peripheral in official conclusions. His explanations accounted for his actions individually, though collectively they formed a pattern that resisted simplicity. As the case transitioned into extended search efforts, attention temporarily shifted away from Tyne and toward the landscape itself. Helicopters scanned river corridors. Volunteers walked trails. Dive teams assessed portions of the Stanislaus River. Each day, without results, subtly reshaped priorities. Still, within case files and private conversations, the same question resurfaced. If Michael walked away on his own, why did someone else step so easily into his place? Solving a case is never only about identifying a suspect. It also depends on the machinery of the legal system and the emotional endurance of the people left behind. In the disappearance of Michael Larry Madden, both systems reached their limits and then froze. By the late 1990 seconds, the Tuolumne County Sheriff's Department internally classified the case as suspicious, at times leaning toward homicide, yet functionally inactive. The reason was not indifference. It was paralysis. Every investigative path eventually led to the same wall: absence of prosecutable evidence. There was a suspect who raised alarms, a timeline that made little sense, and behavior that unsettled even experienced deputies. But there was no body, no blood, no forensic anchor that could survive a courtroom challenge. Time became the enemy. As years passed, whatever physical evidence might once have existed degraded or disappeared entirely. If Michael's boots were ever recovered, any recoverable DNA would likely have broken down. The campsite itself had long since been reclaimed by weather, animals, and human use. The fresh fire that once defined the case existed now only in memory and police notes. A crime scene that never fully crystallized slowly dissolved into recollection. Witness testimony aged as well. The friends who stood at Sandbar Flat in the early hours of August 12, 1996, grew older. Their memories shaped by trauma and repetition. Any future defense attorney would inevitably question the precision of their recall. Did the suspect truly rack the gun repeatedly? Or did fear amplify the motion? Was the word Mikey remembered verbatim or reconstructed over time? These were predictable challenges, and investigators knew it. Memory, unlike physical evidence, erodes in ways no laboratory can reverse. For Michael's family, the investigation's stagnation marked the beginning of a different kind of ordeal, one defined by ambiguous loss. There was no confirmation of death, yet no sign of life, no funeral, no grave, just a suspended reality that never resolved. His mother kept the note Michael left behind, reading it not as a goodbye, but as proof of intention. He had planned to return. That fact never changed. The family did what families in stalled cases often do. They filled the vacuum left by official momentum. They asked questions long after others stopped asking them. They revisited timelines. They contacted investigators, journalists, anyone who might listen. Each attempt carried the same hope, that one overlooked detail, one fresh set of eyes, might shift the case forward. Matilda's return remained central to their understanding of what happened. The dog became, in many ways, the only living witness, silent, loyal, and incomplete. She had survived something Michael had not. That imbalance haunted the family. If she could find her way back, why couldn't he? What moment separated their paths? Within the community of Twain, Hart, and Sonora, the case settled into local memory rather than public action. It became part of the forest's reputation. Spoken about quietly, referenced cautiously. Parents warned children, campers shared stories. The woods carried another layer of unease, shaped by what had never been explained. From a legal standpoint, the case remained open but dormant, waiting for a trigger that never came. A confession remains a piece of physical evidence overlooked decades earlier. Without one of these, the system could move no further. Yet the family never truly stopped searching. Their efforts did not always take the form of organized action. Sometimes it was simply refusing to forget, refusing to let Michael's name collapse into a file number, refusing to accept silence as resolution. The investigation may have stalled, but the absence of answers continued to exert pressure on memory, on trust, on the idea that wilderness tragedies always have natural explanations. And so the case endures. Not because it is unresolved, but because it is unresolved for a reason. The machinery failed to move forward, yet the questions remained intact. At this point in the story, reports end. Timelines blur, and procedure steps aside. What remains are the details that continue to press against reason. This is where I speak as an observer, reading the same files, hearing the same testimony, and reaching the same moment where explanation slows and unease takes over. What unsettles me first is sequence. Everything about this case unfolds in the wrong order. Michael arrives prepared, early in the morning, with a clear plan, familiar terrain, and time on his side. Then, somewhere inside a narrow window, that order collapses. When his friends arrive, they expect reunion. Instead, they encounter occupation. A fire burns where Michael's fire should have been. A man sits where Michael should have been sitting. The space has changed hands, and that transfer feels deliberate. What I keep returning to is choice. A campsite in a national forest offers thousands of exit paths. Leaving would have been easy. Disappearing would have taken minutes. Yet someone stayed. Someone claimed the center of that space, used Michael's resources, controlled the moment, and waited. That decision carries intention. Accidental overlap rarely behaves this way. I also struggle with the behavior during the standoff. The repeated manipulation of the firearm reads as theater. It feels designed to dominate attention, to freeze motion, to stretch time. I imagine the silence between sounds, the scrape of metal, the way every small movement would have carried weight. A person acting from fear usually seeks escape. A person acting from control seeks presence. That distinction matters to me. Then there is language. A single word, spoken casually, lingers longer than any physical clue. Mikey, a name Michael avoided. A name that reduced him. A name that felt wrong in the mouths of those who knew him. Hearing it used in that setting suggests access to personal detail without personal connection. That gap between familiarity and distance feels predatory. I keep asking myself where that word came from and why it was chosen in that moment. The investigation, bound by law, reached its limit early. I understand why. Evidence must carry weight that survives scrutiny. Memory bends. terrain est rase. Time corrodes detail. Yet, understanding the legal ceiling does little to quiet the human response. Suspicion lives comfortably where proof struggles. This case exists in that space. What troubles me most is how little the forest offered back. Wilderness accidents usually leave fragments, fabric, equipment, a bone, something tangible. Here, absence stands alone. Michael disappears. Yet his environment continues unchanged. His car remains. His camp remains. Even his dog eventually returns. The missing element feels specific rather than random. I think about Matilda often, even when I try to focus elsewhere. Her return reshapes everything. Survival suggests movement, awareness, and separation. A dog follows instinct, routine, and loyalty. When that pattern breaks, it usually breaks for a reason. I picture her pausing at the edge of camp days later, confused, searching, then staying. That image carries emotional gravity that data never will. From the family's perspective, time stopped advancing in clean units. Days stretched, years folded inward. Hope transformed into endurance. They lived inside a question mark that never resolved. Every unanswered call, every document request, every passing season added weight. Watching that kind of persistence changes how I interpret the case. It reminds me that unresolved events continue long after files close. I also consider how easily this story could fade. A single missing man, a remote forest, a past decade. Yet it stays present because of one central fact. Someone stepped into Michael's place. That act alone prevents the story from settling into the category of misadventure. It demands a different lens. When I step back, I see a case shaped by proximity rather than chance. A meeting inside isolation. A transfer of space. A silence maintained long enough to outlast process. Whether the truth sits buried in terrain or memory, it remains held in suspension. I do not claim certainty. I claim discomfort. The kind that persists after facts end. The kind that suggests something unresolved rather than something explained away. This story lingers because it resists the easy endings people prefer. It refuses to become tidy. And perhaps that is the final truth of Michael Larry Madden's disappearance. Some stories remain open because closure never arrives. Some questions remain because the answers never surface. All that remains is attention, memory, and the refusal to let a life dissolve into paperwork. As long as this story is told, the silence around it carries less power. What do you think happened to Michael Madden? Was it a tragic accident or something more sinister? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your theories. If you're interested in more true crime stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and follow along for future cases. Until next time.